I picked something a little bit light for us to discuss today. I want us to talk about cycles. And the reason why I picked this, specifically touching on the economy and where we are, is because there tends to be the same type of articles that are written during a recession. And a strong air of pessimism tends to reign within the country that's currently going through that recession. And it's not just privy to Namibia, it happens across the world. And so I just wanted us to understand where it comes from, can we expect a recession and can we expect things to come up? And is there movement, so to speak, where things generally normalize is working? The first thing I decided to do was just to give an idea of how the Namibian economy looks like. Now, this is a bit of an ugly graph, for lack of a better term. I haven't drawn one of this since I was in high school. But if any of you remember what a histogram was, that's very impressive. It basically just captures the frequency of growth ever since 1980. And how many years we've been, let's say, at 1% growth, 2% growth, or even less. So if you look at the graph, you can see that most period in Namibia, we've had about 7 to 8 years where growth has ranged sort of between 3 and 4%. And that tends to be the average for Namibia. Now, economists call this your natural rate of growth. And so that means if you don't have any structural issues in your economy, that's the rate in which it will grow. And that's the case for Namibia. Anything to the right of that is when you've got expansive fiscal policy, when you've got excessive investment. So that's when even spending sometimes overshoots the current level of employment in the country. And that tends to drive up prices, and so we have very good periods of high growth. Anything below that is the exact opposite, where often you would find that there's been maybe periods of fiscal consolidation, companies have shut down, commodity prices have completely dissipated, and so for a country like Namibia, we're not growing. And the reason why I start with that is to say that despite the fact that this past few quarters we've seen that we've been in recession, we do know what our natural rate of growth is. And the minister said this morning that I seem to be a little bit more optimistic. And the answer is because I've seen this graph, Minister. And I know that we will rebound backwards to this level. And how can we see that? So in the early 60s and 70s, economists were debating about the different theories, and some that came out were known as monetarists. And they said that everything in an economy is based on the amount of money. And so all you need to really understand is where the money is. Now, I happen to work for a bank, so for now I really do know where the money is and where it isn't. And so if you just track money in your economy, you can already start telling which cycle you're going through. Now, this is stuff that you can't make up, but it turns out our money cycle, or the credit cycle as some people call it, is based on a very old theory of Joseph in the Bible, and who was told that there will be 7 years, 7 lean years and 7 fat years. Turns out that our money cycle is also based on a 7-year stint. So it's not perfect, but the bars show you what is taking place after every 7 years. And after every 7 years, we tend to have, specifically in Namibia, periods where interest rates have shot up. Now, what does that mean for us? When interest rates shoot up, of course, I work for a bank, so yay, interest income, right? But for everybody else, it means that sometimes it brings about a restriction to your spending. And normally, if interest rates have gone up, there should be an asset that gets impacted immediately. You've got your central bank, it affects interest rates, and then it should trickle through the economy. And so fortuitously, about 6 months ago, we had started an exercise to actually collect property prices from 1990. So we have a slightly longer series. And you find that this is what happens to growth in the property market. And in the exact same way, just after those long periods of interest rates, you tend to have then afterwards, when interest rates dip, property prices going up because people are buying property prices. Who can guess after how many years property prices also goes through a cycle? 7 years. And so through 7 years, we go through another cycle where property goes up and then it goes down. So at the top of the period is what we call a peak, and then it goes through a downturn, then it hits a trough, which is at the bottom, and then it goes through an upswing, and then it goes back to that peak, and the cycle continues. And so, of course, after your asset has been impacted, it goes and affects the next thing, which tends to be expenditure. And so expenditure tends to be your fiscal consolidation. Now, I'd like to thank Robin Sherburn, who has managed to give us one of the longest series that we have for government expenditure. It's not easy to go back into the archives. But I looked at expenditure in terms of how the increases in expenditure that we've had since around about 1992. And funny enough, you can't make this stuff up. Just after about every 7 or 8 years, we tend to have those same peaks as well in expenditure, where expenditure ramps up to an extremely high level and then it falls down. Now, putting all of that together, this is what it does in terms of growth. Now, excluding the fact that we have had about 2 or 3 global recessions during that same period of time, just the cycle in which money is flowing and how it translates and impacts our property prices has also led to a relatively 7-year period where, so to speak, where growth reaches its maximum and then it drops, goes through a downturn, stays sort of medium, and then it picks up again. And if you understand this, it gives you perspective when you're starting to write your articles, when you're explaining the economy, because all you need to do then is not necessarily focus on what's happening today, but focus on the behavior that surrounds periods when the economy is either doing extremely well or periods where the economy is not doing particularly well. And so let's start with where we are now, where, as you may have heard, growth came in at negative 1.7, I believe, for the second quarter and minus 2.7 for the first quarter. So we're firmly planted within a recession, though we're seeing that growth is coming out from mining and agriculture, and we're optimistic about that. There tends to be a certain behavior that takes place in the economy. First of all, is that your prices are erratic. Now, the reason why I didn't say necessarily that there's inflation, deflation, because it depends on the economy. In the US, it goes the completely opposite way. People completely stop buying during a recessionary environment, or that's how it seems like. So their prices drop aggressively. But what we've found in emerging markets is that you'll initially have periods where prices go up quite extensively because the immediate thinking for businesses, like if we're going through a tough time, so we must increase our prices, which is wrong for emerging markets, but that tends to happen. So your prices are erratic. And then there tends to be high unemployment. And as we have seen in Namibia, this is very true. We have lost about 144,000 jobs over just 2 years. And we know this has come from the dip that took place in the construction sector. But if you follow closely sectors such as wholesale and retail trade, which we started monitoring as well, you find that there's been substantial declines in that. We saw the sector was already in recession mid last year, but the numbers sort of hadn't seeped into GDP. People just aren't shopping as frequently as they are at the furniture stores. Mall activity has declined, and this is something that we have line of sight of. We also tend to have structural changes, so you can have a whole industry completely collapse. Now, going back to construction simply because, and I'm not necessarily singling it out, but it tends to be a very good example. A few years ago, every single quarter, the output used to be just over 2 billion. If you look at the latest numbers, it's hovering at about 600 million. Now, a lot of that output, people say, was based on the fact that we were building new mines, but even if you remove that, the natural rate of output from construction sector per quarter should be between about 1 billion and 1.5 billion. So for it to come down to just over 500 million also tends to give you a bit of problems. The fourth point is industrial action. So you tend to have a lot of strikes, a lot of complaints, and this of course emanates from the fact that people believe that they should still receive 8 to 9% increments in their salary when they're told that you are lucky if you get an increase. And so you tend to have a lot of people who would start up industrial action and the likes. And if your country is particularly unionized, you would tend to have an issue or a case like that of South Africa. Or I would like to say like the French, but the French don't really need a recession or good economic times for them to pick it. They tend to do it at any time that's available. But that tends to be what happens in the economy. And then of course demand will wane. So eventually businesses will get worried about investing, individuals get worried about investments and spending, so you tend to have lower output. And trade increases are not necessarily a good thing. You tend to have people who often sometimes rely on the import products because they're coming in much cheaper as opposed to the local products. So it tends to then worsen the situation because then the overall output of the country declines further. Normally, in a slump as well, you would have expansionary policy. And now this is quite key for especially a country like Namibia. So with all that's been taking place, in a situation like this, we should have had economists standing up and advising the Honourable Minister that it's time for you to spend to reignite the economy. Fortunately, the Minister tells us, no, actually we're going the other way. It's time for consolidation. So now if you can't have expansionary policy during a slump, then it'll just tend to increase that because people have often relied on it. And that's, of course, only in a situation where you've got government being about 60% of the economy. In other places where government accounts for much less, then you don't necessarily need to rely on expansionary policy. Now, this is what now happens sort of individually to you and I, and this is potentially what it is we can see. Consumers start bargaining. And this is a skill that a lot of people only use when they go on holidays. But suddenly it's become well known in Namibia now because you walk into every shop and nobody wants to take the price that's there, asking for discounts. You're buying a house has become the beautiful one because we've seen where people are buying property up to $1 million below valuation. So they're told that the property price is going to be $3.5 million, and the consumer just looks at the man and is like, I'll give you 2.2. And this goes on for 3 months, and eventually the seller sells it at that price. So it becomes a buyer's market. And then there's a lot of window shopping. And the reason why there's window shopping is because a lot of people still believe that they need to be seen like they're okay. Right? So if you've always shopped at certain places, you still walk into that shop over the weekend. You may not necessarily buy anything, but you window shop. And I think the best place to see this is Grove. Yeah. Because Grove, you will see people walking up and down, smiling, having ice cream from Microberry, but there's not a lot of purchases that are actually taking place. And then there's also brand disloyalty. I mean, the slightest thing that takes place in a particular brand, they will try and switch, you know. Nike shoes, you fell while you were running. It's like, I'm no longer buying Nike. I might as well just buy shoes from the Chinese store. But that's really not just an issue with Nike. It's just that, you can't afford the shoes anymore. You're just trying to find a reason. And then this is something else that comes, but apparently in Europe, they found it particularly known for women. There's a lot of I deserve it purchases. So a lot of women or a lot of people decide it's the best time to go to a spa because I deserve it. I've worked extremely hard. I need a massage. I need this new top. I need to buy it. I need a new car. I deserve it. I've worked hard. So you tend to have this periods in time where people just spend sporadically. And then, of course, if they can use credit, they will. So they've already got home loans. They've got vehicle asset finance, particularly from Westbank. We give the best rates. Though this is not an advertising platform. I'm not a salesperson. Then they get their overdraft facility, and then soon afterwards they ask for a credit card, and then they do that nice thing where they walk into Standard Bank and ask for the same credit card and overdraft facility, and then they call us at the bank or they call their friends and they ask us questions like, if I take out credit at FNB, will Standard Bank know that I took a loan from? So that tends to take place, and the reason for that is for the last point where I've written PIH prevails, which is a theory called permanent income hypothesis. It takes a long time for people to realize that times are tough. So they really want to maintain the same level of standards. If they used to go out every week, they will keep going out. If they used to go out for dinner, yeah, they'll still go out, but they'll order something a little bit more palatable, like water, and then they'll ask for lemon and ice so that it just looks a little bit more sparkly. But we all know it's tap water, and they didn't actually buy it. And then businesses, they go down the other road. Suddenly there's a strong discussion about cost management. And this word changes, right? We're managing costs. We're trying to keep costs at bay. And that tends to be the discussion. It's not so much about increasing output, let's just manage costs. And if we can do that, we'll go through the cycle. Mergers and acquisition, look, again, there have been a few in the market. I can't, for the life of me, think of any. Has there been any acquisition recently? Definitely nothing, no. But this tends to happen where smaller companies are bought out, and it's very common. So if you're writing articles, I mean, the easiest time to see whether a country is going to go into recession, just go to your competition commission and ask them, how many applications did you receive for mergers and acquisitions? And if you see that number has doubled, you just know times are tough. And so that's another easy thing. Another thing is clever pricing. And clever pricing comes from products. So how do we package products in an integrated way? Now you get a way, where you can pick your own bundle. Before, products used to be very simple. Then everybody is coming up with new ways to price them and the likes. And then, of course, you have structural decline. So a whole industry either becomes completely mechanized. So in the same vein that they're trying to do cost management, people are trying to figure out how can we automate a lot of this process so we can free up resources to increase output, etc., etc. And so that tends to be the behavior. Now, putting all of that into consideration, the question then comes is, when a country is in a slump, like we are in right now, and you've got now external pressures. So it's not only what we're going through, but you've got external pressures of people who are constantly watching over you like a hawk, telling you the best way to run your country. It can become a very difficult situation for government to allow that leeway to increase expenditure as it should, to support industries as it should. I think it was a particularly difficult time this year. I went to one press conference where people were concerned about the liquidation of a potential company, and their concern was too many people will become unemployed. But the issue didn't become how many people will become unemployed, it becomes how many billions of dollars have we spent giving that company a bailout. So the conversation changes simply because we've got hawks who are looking at us. And the reason why I put this up is because the rating agencies look at you as a basket. And so they don't look at Namibia as a country on its own, as it's known. They look at it as Namibia in relation to those countries up there. So this is Fitch. So Fitch compares us to Hungary, to Aruba, Azerbaijan, that one, Bulgaria, India, Indonesia, Morocco, Philippines, Romania, Russia, Uruguay. They're all either stable, negative outlook, doesn't really matter, but they're given that rating of triple B minus. And so what they say is, what is the median for economic indicators that they have? And they say that, peer median, the budget deficit or surplus should actually be positive at 2.7%, while unfortunately for Namibia it was negative. It probably has improved now to the 3.6. Peer median they say is 41%. Namibia they say, okay, yours is a bit lower, so you're doing well there. Current account, you're not doing too great. Debt service, you're doing great. Growth, you're not doing too great. Import cover, you're not doing too great. And just by those matrix, they decide that whether they're going to upgrade you or downgrade you. Now, it's not necessarily a fair practice. I personally don't follow rating agencies. I don't think it's fair for people who don't necessarily often do business in Africa to tell us how to do business in Africa. And it's a sentiment that I share with certain asset managers and the likes. But it is there, and it is visible, and it has impacted a lot of the spending that we've had over the past few years. But it's important for us to report accordingly. So it's not necessarily that our expenditure has run away, as everybody calls it, and oh no, look at what the minister's done, we're being downgraded. Think about relative to our peers, how is the country performing? And I'd like to see an article where somebody comes and writes, this is how Namibia looks like, but this is also what's been going on in Indonesia, which is rated the same way. Why were they kept it stable, and why were we downgraded? I think those are the better questions that need to be asked, instead of us running along with what it is we see sort of like in the market. Now, for Namibia, we understand the structure of our economy. We know it particularly well. And for an environment like ours, we need to then understand where we should focus on. We know that the biggest impact to our economy is a wholesale and retail trade and repairs. It accounts for 13% of our GDP. So when we focus or do focus pieces, it's always imperative that we understand how important that sector is to the overall economy. And not a lot of people like writing about this, more often than not, because it's foreign-based companies that are operating here, and people often say that it's the profits that are going back to South Africa. But please understand that it's employing about, I think it's just over 80,000 people of the labor force are in this sector, if not more. So there needs to be more attention as to really how growth is taking place in that environment. How are the furniture stores doing? How are the shops doing? So we can understand potentially when also the tide turns. Because once they start picking up, we can then tell that the economy will recover. Agriculture and forestry is often a very low contributor to GDP, but it employs 70% of the people. And the optimism that people have right now in the country is simply because we had a very good rainy season, and we know there's a surplus of food. And if you speak to people and speak to farmers, they'll tell you, oh, look, it rains, so I'm fine. The economy will also be okay eventually. When we have a hydrological drought and everything else is fine, then you tend to have complaints and ennui in the country. And then, of course, you can't necessarily see it clearly just because of point, but the 9% represents mining sector. Now, we know commodity prices are recovering, but is that enough? And I think that that's the question we need to ask. Is we've always known that mining supports our growth, but does it really trickle down to the economy? And so the question we should be asking is, what's the level of taxes that are being generated by the mining companies, so that we can know how much that supports a government? And I think when we change our focus simply from output from uranium has jumped us, we ask the difficult question, what's the level of taxes you're actually going to expect from these entities? That's the only way it really trickles down to you and I, and it can actually impact our production. And so this is often the story and where we sit right now. And so the question is coming, what will government do then to get us out of this situation? And today there was a front page article from the Namibian where I think there's some discussion about privatization and sort of letting the public come on board, private sector come on board. And that's a point in the right direction. But I think what we need to interrogate is the timeline. So we shouldn't just necessarily speak about it, but how soon will we see some of these companies privatized so we can relieve the weight from government, and so such that when government is going through its normal cycle, that we can be counter-cyclical and not necessarily rely on a situation where there's been fiscal consolidation and then suddenly the whole economy, we're on the back foot as well. Thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope it was also practical.